The frozen corpse of Private Samuel Morrison lay sprawled across the cobblestones of King Street, his blood crystallizing in the bitter January air of 1777. Steam rose from the crimson pool beneath him as Colonel Charles Mawhood stepped over the body, his scarlet uniform a stark contrast against the snow-dusted ground of Princeton, New Jersey. What neither the dying American nor the confident British officer knew was that this moment would mark the beginning of a battle that would transform a failing rebellion into a legitimate revolution. General George Washington sat astride his white Charger 3 miles south of Princeton, his weathered face etched with the weight of impossible decisions. The Continental Army had barely survived the retreat across New Jersey, their ranks decimated by desertion, disease, and defeat. The stunning victory at Trenton 9 days earlier had provided a momentary reprieve, but Washington knew that lightning rarely struck twice in the same place. Yet here he was, gambling everything on another audacious winter assault. The morning of January 3rd, 1777, dawned with a crystalline clarity that cut through the soul. Major General Nathanael Greene's division had been marching since 2 o'clock in the morning, their feet wrapped in bloodied rags, leaving a crimson trail in the snow. Artillery wheels creaked and groaned as Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery struggled through the frozen ruts of the Quaker Road. The men's breath formed ghostly clouds in the Arctic air, and Washington could hear the quiet prayers whispered by soldiers who understood they were marching toward either salvation or annihilation. Lieutenant Colonel John Fitzgerald rode up beside his commander, his horse's flanks steaming in the cold. "General, the advance guard reports movement at Princeton. It appears Colonel Mawhood's regiment is preparing to march toward Trenton." Washington's ice-blue eyes narrowed as he processed this intelligence. The British 3rd Battalion of Light Infantry, supported by elements of the 17th Foot and some mounted dragoons, represented a formidable force. But they were also isolated, cut off from the main British garrison at Brunswick. As documented in Frank Moore's Diary of the American Revolution, the strategic situation facing Washington was desperate beyond measure. The Continental Congress had fled Philadelphia, many considering the cause lost, while British forces under General William Howe controlled much of New Jersey. This context underscores the magnitude of what Washington was attempting on this frozen morning. The sound of musket fire echoed across the frost-covered fields as American advance scouts clashed with British sentries near the Stony Brook Bridge. Washington spurred his horse forward, knowing that hesitation would mean defeat. Behind him, nearly 5,000 Continental soldiers and militia advanced through the morning mist, their bayonets glinting like deadly icicles in the pale winter sun. The fate of American independence hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of a sword wielded by men whose very survival depended on victory. In the distance, the bells of Nassau Hall began to toll, their bronze voices carrying across the frozen landscape like a funeral dirge. Neither army knew it yet, but this cold morning in Princeton would echo through history, transforming a desperate gamble into the moment when the American Revolution truly began. Colonel Charles Mawhood had been a soldier for 23 years, long enough to recognize the sound of approaching doom. The irregular pop of musket fire from his pickets near Stony Brook meant more than scattered rebels probing his defenses. As he adjusted his brass gorget and checked his sword, Mawhood's experienced ear detected the rhythmic crunch of hundreds of feet marching through frozen ground. The Americans were coming in force. Captain William Scott of the 40th Foot burst into Mawhood's quarters at Clark's house, his face flushed from the bitter cold and exertion. "Sir, our advance guard reports a substantial American column approaching from the southwest. Captain Phillips estimates at least a brigade's, possibly more." Mawhood's jaw tightened as he absorbed this information. His orders from General Cornwallis had been specific: march to Trenton and support the garrison there. But Washington had outmaneuvered them all. The British colonel moved with practiced efficiency, shouting orders that sent his men scrambling from their warm quarters into the brutal January morning. The 17th Foot formed ranks with mechanical precision, their redcoats bright against the white landscape. The light infantry scattered into skirmish formation, while the dragoons mounted their snorting, vapor-breathing horses. Mawhood knew his 800 men faced overwhelming odds, but retreat was not in his vocabulary. Meanwhile, Brigadier General Hugh Mercer's brigade advanced through the William Clark orchard, their footsteps muffled by the snow-covered ground. The veteran Continental soldiers moved like ghosts between the bare apple trees, their brown uniforms blending with the winter shadows. Mercer himself rode at their head, his Scottish accent cutting through the cold air as he issued quiet commands to his company officers. The 56-year-old physician-turned-soldier had fought beside Washington in the French and Indian War, and both men understood that today would test every lesson learned into decades of frontier warfare. Captain Daniel Neal of the 3rd Virginia Regiment raised his hand, bringing his company to a halt as they reached the edge of the orchard. Through the bare branches, he could see red-coated figures moving across the frost-covered field beyond. The British were deploying for battle, their movements as precise as clockwork despite the treacherous footing. Neal's men crouched behind trees and stone walls, checking their flints and adjusting their cartridge boxes with the nervous energy of soldiers who knew death was minutes away. The first British volley erupted like thunder across the frozen landscape, orange flames stabbing through the gray morning air. Musket balls whined through the apple branches, sending bark and with splinters flying. Private James Henderson of the 1st Continental Artillery screamed as a ball shattered his left shoulder, his blood spattering the snow-white ground. The battle for Princeton had begun in earnest. According to the Pennsylvania Packet of January 14, 1777, the opening engagement at Princeton demonstrated the improved training and discipline of the Continental forces, marking a crucial evolution in American military capability. General Mercer spurred his horse forward, his sword gleaming in the pale sunlight as he shouted encouragement to his men. "Steady, lads. Give them a taste of American steel." The Continental soldiers rose from their concealment and returned fire, their muskets crackling like breaking timber. The acrid smoke of black powder began to drift across the battlefield, carrying with it the metallic scent of spilled blood and the promise of either victory or death. The morning sun climbed higher over Princeton, casting long shadows across a battlefield already littered with the dead and dying. General Hugh Mercer felt the British bayonet tear through his abdomen, the cold steel followed by a burning sensation that spread through his body like liquid fire as he fell from his horse. The veteran officer saw his brigade beginning to waver under the relentless British assault. The Redcoats were advancing with their characteristic precision, their bayonets glinting like deadly needles in the winter light. Captain John Fleming of the 1st Delaware Regiment watched in horror as General Mercer crumpled to the frozen ground. The British light infantry was pushing forward through the orchard, their disciplined volleys cutting down Continental soldiers with mechanical efficiency. Fleming's own company was beginning to break, men stumbling backward through the snow, as panic spread through their ranks like a contagion. The carefully planned American attack was dissolving into chaos. From his position on the Quaker Road, General Washington could see the disaster unfolding in the orchard. Through his spyglass, he watched Mercer's men streaming back toward the main American line, their formation shattered by British steel and discipline. The fate of the entire battle hung in the balance, and Washington knew that hesitation would mean not just defeat, but the complete collapse of the Continental cause. His army could not survive another retreat. Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery battery wheeled into position on the rising ground south of Princeton, the bronze cannons gleaming dully in the pale sunlight. The young West Indian officer shouted commands to his gun crews as they loaded their weapons with grape shot, the deadly clusters of iron balls that could shred infantry formations like paper. Hamilton's experience calculated ranges and angles, while his gunners worked with the swift precision of men who knew their lives depended on speed and accuracy. Washington spurred his white horse forward, riding directly toward the wavering American line. His blue and buff uniform made him a perfect target for British marksmen, but the commanding general seemed oblivious to the musket balls whizzing past his head. Behind him rode his staff officers, their faces tense with the knowledge that their commander was exposing himself to almost certain death. Yet Washington's presence on the battlefield had an immediate effect on his retreating soldiers. "Stand fast, my brave fellows." Washington's voice carried across the frozen field with remarkable clarity. "The day is ours if we but hold our ground." The sight of their commander riding calmly through the storm of British fire seemed to transform the Continental soldiers. Men who had been running moments before suddenly stopped, turned, and began forming new battle lines. The retreat became a rally, fear transformed into determination. Colonel Daniel Hitchcock's Rhode Island Regiment moved forward to support the wavering center, their steady advance providing an anchor for the reformed American line. These men had survived the grueling winter march from the Hudson River, their ranks thinned by cold and disease, but their spirits hardened by months of adversity. Hitchcock himself walked among his companies, his calm demeanor spreading confidence through the ranks like ripples on a pond. As noted in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study, Washington's Crossing, the personal courage displayed by American officers at Princeton represented a fundamental shift in Continental Army leadership, transforming it from a collection of militia units into a professional military force. The British advance slowed. As Colonel Mawhood recognized the changing dynamics of the battle, his own men, magnificent in their initial assault, were now facing a reformed and determined enemy supported by artillery. The easy victory that had seemed within grasp moments before was slipping away like smoke in the winter wind. Mawhood knew that his isolated command was now fighting for survival rather than conquest. Captain William Shippen of the 4th Continental Artillery felt the ground shake beneath his feet as the British 6-pounder ball struck the frozen earth. Just 10 yards from his gun position, clods of dirt and ice showered down on his crew. But the veteran gunners continued their deadly work with mechanical precision. The bronze barrel of their cannon was growing hot despite the bitter January cold, testament to the rapid fire they had maintained for nearly 30 minutes. Shippen wiped blood from a splinter cut on his cheek and called out new firing instructions to his powder-stained crew. Colonel Charles Mawhood's horse reared and screamed as grape shot from Hamilton's battery tore through the British ranks. The animal's front legs pawed frantically at the air before crashing down, its flanks heaving with terror and pain. Mawhood rolled clear of his dying mount and struggled to his feet, his scarlet uniform torn and stained with his horse's blood. Around him, the disciplined ranks of the 17th Foot were beginning to show gaps where American artillery had found its mark. The tide of battle was shifting with the inexorable force of ocean waves. What had begun as a British tactical victory was transforming into something far more dangerous. For Mawhood's isolated command, the American line, which had seemed on the verge of collapse less than an hour before, was now pressing forward with renewed confidence. Continental soldiers who had fled in panic were returning to the fight, their muskets adding to the growing volume of fire directed at the British positions. Sergeant Major Patrick O'Connor of the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment led his company through the smoke-filled orchard, stepping carefully around the bodies of friend and foe alike. The Irish-born veteran had fought in 3 major engagements during the retreat across New Jersey, and he recognized the subtle signs that indicated a battle's outcome. The British were no longer advancing. Their volleys were becoming irregular, their formations less precise. Most telling of all, their officers were looking over their shoulders toward the road leading back to Brunswick. General Washington rode among his troops like an avenging angel, his presence seeming to inspire ordinary men to extraordinary courage. Private Samuel Webb of the Connecticut Line would later write to his sister that seeing the general under fire was like watching Providence itself intervene in human affairs. Washington's horse was struck twice by musket balls, but continued to carry its rider through the storm of British fire, as if the animal itself understood the magnitude of what was at stake. The sound of splintering would echo across the battlefield as American artillery found the range to the British gun positions. Captain Thomas Forrest's Pennsylvania battery had moved forward to within 200 yards of the enemy line, close enough that his gunners could see the faces of the redcoats they were targeting. The bronze barrels of his 6-pounders spoke with authority, sending iron death into the ranks of men who had seemed invincible just hours before. Major General Nathanael Greene's division was now advancing on the British left flank, their movement coordinated with the precision of a ballet. The Rhode Island blacksmith-turned-general had spent months drilling his men in the art of battlefield maneuver, and those long hours of practice were paying dividends in the crucible of combat. Greene's soldiers moved like clockwork, each regiment knowing its role in the larger tactical symphony. Contemporary accounts from the New Jersey Gazette of January 8, 1777, described the transformation of American military capability at Princeton as nothing short of miraculous, noting how Continental forces displayed European-style discipline while maintaining their characteristic frontier adaptability. Colonel Mawhood could feel control of the battle slipping from his grasp like sand. Through his fingers, his own casualties were mounting steadily, and the American artillery was making it impossible to maintain cohesive formations. Worse still, his scouts were reporting additional American forces moving to cut off his line of retreat to Brunswick. The trap was closing, and Mawhood faced the nightmare scenario of every military commander: annihilation in detail. The screams of wounded horses mingled with the cries of dying men as the battle for Princeton reached its climax. Private William Crawford of the 5th Pennsylvania Regiment stumbled through the smoke-choked orchard, his bayonet dripping with British blood. The 18-year-old farm boy from Lancaster County had never killed a man before this morning, but the savage intimacy of hand-to-hand combat had transformed him into something harder than the frozen ground beneath his feet. Around him, the winter landscape was being painted red with the price of American independence. Colonel Charles Mawhood knew his position was becoming untenable. The American artillery had found the range to his formations, and each iron ball that crashed into his ranks carried away men he could not afford to lose. His light infantry companies, the pride of British tactical doctrine, were being systematically destroyed by Continental soldiers who fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. Mawhood's military experience told him that retreat was the only rational option, but his orders from General Cornwallis had been explicit: hold Princeton at all costs. Captain Apollos Morris of the 4th Continental Artillery watched through his spyglass as British soldiers began falling back from their advanced positions. The young officer had been born in Morristown, less than 20 miles from this battlefield, and he understood that he was fighting for more than military victory. This was about whether New Jersey would remain under British occupation or be restored to American control. Morris called out range corrections to his gun crews, each shot carefully aimed to maximize casualties among the retreating redcoats. The stone walls and split-rail fences around Princeton began to serve as impromptu fortifications for both armies. Sergeant Robert Young of the British 17th Foot crouched behind a low-field stone barrier, ramming a fresh charge down the barrel of his musket with practiced efficiency. Around him, his surviving comrades were maintaining a disciplined rate of fire despite the chaos swirling around their position. Young had served in the West Indies and knew that retreat under fire was one of the most dangerous maneuvers in warfare. General Washington's white horse stepped delicately round, the bodies scattered across the frozen ground, its rider seemingly oblivious to the musket balls that continued to buzz past his head like angry hornets. The commanding general's uniform was torn in several places, and a British ball had creased his left shoulder without his apparent notice. Washington's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hanson Harrison, rode close beside his commander, ready to shield him with his own body if necessary. The pursuit was becoming as deadly as the initial engagement. American soldiers, their blood heated by the prospect of victory, pressed forward with increasing aggression. Captain Samuel Brady of the 8th Pennsylvania Regiment led his company in a flanking movement that brought them within 50 yards of the British rear guard. Brady's frontiersmen, many of them veterans of Indian warfare, moved through the winter landscape with deadly efficiency, their long rifles picking off British officers with methodical precision. Nassau Hall, the imposing stone edifice that served as the heart of the College of New Jersey, loomed over the battlefield like a silent witness to history. British soldiers had occupied the building since November, using its dormitory rooms as barracks and its library as an officer's mess. Now American artillery was directing its attention to the massive structure, iron cannonballs chipping away at stonework that had stood for 30 years. The symbolism was not lost on either army. This was American learning driving out British occupation. According to William Stryker's authoritative The Battles of Trenton and Princeton, the fighting around Nassau Hall represented some of the most intense urban combat of the entire Revolutionary War, with soldiers fighting room by room through buildings that had once echoed with scholarly debates. Major John Kelly of the British 40th Foot felt the American bayonet slide between his ribs, the steel blade scraping against bone as it pierced his lung. The Irish-born officer had survived Lexington, Bunker Hill, and the Long Island Campaign, but his luck had finally run out on this frozen January morning as he fell to his knees. Kelly could see more American soldiers pouring through the gaps in the British line, their faces blackened with powder smoke and hardened by months of adversity. The retreat was becoming a rout. British discipline, legendary throughout Europe, was cracking under the relentless pressure of American pursuit. Red-coated soldiers, who had marched in perfect formation just hours before, were now running individually through the streets of Princeton, seeking any escape from the Continental Army that had seemingly risen from the dead. The brass buttons on Captain Jonathan Foreman's Continental uniform gleamed with droplets of melted snow as he led his New Jersey militia through the streets of Princeton. The 32-year-old liar from Freehold had watched British soldiers burn his neighbors' homes and steal their livestock for months, and now justice was finally within reach. His men moved from house to house with grim efficiency, rooting out British soldiers who had taken refuge in cellars and attics throughout the town. Colonel Charles Mawhood's retreat had become a nightmare of military confusion. His carefully planned withdrawal was dissolving into chaos as American pursuers pressed their advantage with relentless determination. The British officer found himself commanding a collection of scattered companies rather than a coherent regiment, his men strung out along the road to Brunswick like beads on a broken string. Every few minutes, the crack of American rifles would claim another redcoat, adding to the growing list of casualties that Mawhood would have to explain to his superiors. Nassau Hall's massive oak doors splintered under the impact of American axe blows, sending wooden fragments flying across the entrance hall. Corporal James Madison of the 1st Virginia Regiment, a distant cousin of the future president, was among the first Continental soldiers to enter the imposing building. The sight that greeted him was one of scholarly chaos. British soldiers had used textbooks and philosophical treatises as fuel for their fires, leaving the library strewn with the ashes of accumulated learning. Captain Alexander Hamilton, personally, aimed his 6-pounder cannon at the portrait of King George II that dominated Nassau Hall's main chamber. The young artillery officer's shot was perfectly placed, decapitating the painted monarch with a single iron ball. The symbolism of the moment was not lost on the American soldiers who witnessed it. British authority in New Jersey was being systematically destroyed. One cannonball at a time, the pursuit continued beyond Princeton itself, with American cavalry units harrying the retreating British columns along the post road. Captain John Fitzpatrick's light horse had been reinforced with local militia who knew every farmhouse and forest path in the region. These men rode with the fury of the dispossessed, seeking vengeance for months of British occupation. Their knowledge of the local terrain allowed them to appear suddenly from side roads and woodlots, striking at British stragglers before melting back into the winter landscape. Surgeon General John Cochrane moved through the battlefield with methodical efficiency, tending to wounded men from both armies with equal care. The Scottish-born physician had served in the British Army during the 7 Years' War, and he understood that military necessity often required treating the enemy with the same attention given to one's own soldiers. His medical wagons were soon filled with men whose groans and cries testified to the terrible intimacy of 18th century warfare. The British garrison at Brunswick could hear the sound of artillery fire drifting across the frozen New Jersey landscape, each distant boom a reminder that their isolated outposts were under systematic attack. General Cornwallis had left strict orders about maintaining control of the Delaware River crossings, but those instructions seemed increasingly irrelevant as American forces demonstrated their ability to strike at will throughout the region. As documented in the Pennsylvania Evening Post of January 7, 1777, the American victory at Princeton sent shockwaves throughout British military circles, forcing a complete reassessment of rebel capabilities and strategic intentions. Private Thomas Thompson of the British 17th Foot collapsed beside the road 3 miles east of Princeton, his strength finally giving out after hours of desperate retreat. The 19-year-old soldier from Yorkshire had been wounded in the thigh during the initial engagement, and the combination of blood loss and exhaustion had rendered him incapable of keeping up with his fleeing comrades. As American voices grew louder behind him, Thompson prepared himself for capture or death, whichever came first. General Washington allowed himself a moment of satisfaction as he surveyed the field of victory. The Continental Army had achieved something that many military experts had declared impossible. They had defeated regular British troops in open battle, capturing artillery, supplies, and prisoners in the process. More importantly, they had demonstrated that American independence was not just a political aspiration, but a military reality backed by steel and gunpowder. The sun was beginning to set over Princeton, casting long shadows across a landscape forever changed by 8 hours of combat. British authority in New Jersey lay shattered like the ice on the Delaware River, while American confidence had been restored by a victory that would echo through the corridors of power in London and Paris alike. The evening of January 3, 1777, found General George Washington standing in the President's house of the College of New Jersey, his muddy boots leaving dark stains on Persian carpets that had once graced British officers' quarters. Outside, his victorious army was settling into positions around Princeton, their campfires casting dancing shadows against Nassau Hall's bullet-scarred walls. The commanding general's weathered face showed the strain of 18 months of war, but his ice-blue eyes held a glimmer of something that had been absent since the dark days of the retreat across New Jersey hoped Captain Alexander Hamilton, bent over his field desk, quill pens scratching rapidly across parchment as he composed dispatches that would carry news of the victory to Philadelphia and beyond. The young West Indians' artillery had played a crucial role in the day's success, and now his educated pen would help shape how history remembered the battle. Hamilton understood that military victories meant nothing without political support, and his carefully crafted reports would help convince wavering patriots that the American cause was far from lost. Colonel Charles Mawhood's battered remnants had finally reached the safety of British lines at Brunswick, but the defeated officer knew that his military reputation lay in ruins. Alongside his shattered regiment, of the 800 men who had marched out of Princeton that morning, fewer than 400 remained fit for duty. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Scattered across 20 miles of frozen New Jersey countryside, Mawhood's official report would blame superior American numbers. But he knew the truth was more complex and more damaging to British prestige. The political ramifications of Princeton extended far beyond the military sphere. In Philadelphia, members of the Continental Congress, who had been preparing to negotiate peace terms with General Howe, suddenly found themselves reconsidering their positions. Representative John Hancock of Massachusetts penned urgent letters to European allies, informing them that American resistance was not only continuing, but actually strengthening. The victory at Princeton had transformed a failing rebellion into a legitimate revolution, worthy of foreign support. Surgeon General John Cochrane's casualty reports painted a stark picture of 18th century warfare's human cost. American losses totaled 44 dead and wounded, while British casualties exceeded 100. Not counting prisoners and missing men, these numbers, modest by later standards, represented catastrophic losses for armies that rarely exceeded a few thousand men. Each casualty list contained names that would be remembered in small towns and rural counties for generations to come. The strategic implications of Washington's winter offensive extended throughout British-occupied territories. General William Howe, comfortable in his Philadelphia headquarters, suddenly found himself commanding isolated garrisons that could be attacked at will by an enemy he had assumed was defeated. British control of New York City remained secure, but their authority over the countryside had evaporated like morning mist. The rebellion that British leaders had expected to collapse by Christmas was instead showing signs of dangerous vitality. King George III received word of the Princeton defeat in early February, the news arriving at Windsor Castle alongside reports of French military preparations and Spanish diplomatic initiatives. The British monarch's ministers were beginning to understand that their American problem was evolving into a global conflict that would test the resources of the British Empire itself. What had begun as a police action against rebellious colonists was becoming a war for empire that would rage across 3 continents. In a detailed analysis published in the London Chronicle of February 12, 1777, military correspondent Nathaniel Wraxall observed that American victories at Trenton, at Princeton had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in North America, transforming the colonial uprising into what he termed a genuine war of independence. The frozen ground around Princeton began to thaw as winter slowly gave way to spring, revealing artifacts of battle that would be discovered by farmers for decades to come. Musket balls embedded in apple trees, broken bayonets buried in garden soil, brass buttons from military uniforms scattered across what had once been peaceful fields. These physical remnants served as silent testimony to a morning when the fate of American independence had been decided by men willing to die for principles they could barely articulate. General Washington's army marched away from Princeton on January 4th, but they left behind something more valuable than military supplies or captured artillery. They had proven that American independence was not just a political dream, but a military reality that could be defended with blood and steel. The cold morning in Princeton had indeed reshaped the Revolutionary War, transforming it from a regional uprising into a conflict that would change the course of world history. As the last American soldiers disappeared over the horizon, Princeton returned to the quiet routine of a college town, but the echoes of that January battle would resonate through the halls of Nassau Hall for centuries to come. The young men who would study there in future generations would walk across ground consecrated by the blood of patriots, their education taking place in buildings where American independence had been born in fire and forged in victory.